Hey guys, it's me, your old pal Clayton. Let's see what we got here today. Came by way of Posta Slovenia. It says synthesizer components quantity 2. So let's open her up. What do you call an unboxing if there's no box? So the description on the package was correct. Synthesizer quantities 2. We've got the HEX HAUS HEX COR and the HEX HAUS HEX LAG. All right, let's get specific. Booklet. Oh, that's a thing of beauty there. Look at that. Nice looking PCB. This is the backing. It appears to be wood. And we have lots of little bits. So the next thing, I guess, is to get those little bits and solder them onto this beauty. Smash cut. So as you can see, I got the DIY kit version. It was about €100. And I also picked up the HEX LAG, same price, plus another €20 for shipping to the United States. The already fabricated version was a little bit more, but I like building things, so I jumped at the opportunity to do so, especially because it was cheaper. The build is pretty straightforward. I do not claim to be an expert in soldering, so if I can do it, you can do it. You can see I use a little piece of tape just to keep this component in place because it wants to fall out when you flip over the board to do the soldering. There was only one little tricky part, which was this little capacitor. He's just so small, and he's a surface mounted component, and that involves a little different technique than pins and pads. So here's this little capacitor, and what you do is you just tin both of the pads at first, and then you plop the capacitor on there. I was using some tweezers, and you just kind of go from one pad to the other, sticking your soldering iron underneath the capacitor to melt that solder, and then the capacitor will just kind of plop down into place. They demonstrate this technique in the HEX HAUS build video, which I highly recommend. If you're going to be building this thing, you might as well just have the build video playing while you're doing it. It comes with instructions, but the video, watching it done, is a lot more informative and useful. I highly recommend you use a fine edge. That's my dog. Hey, stop doing that. Come on. Come on. Good girl. Getting back to it, I highly recommend you use a fine tip on your soldering iron, not the kind of chiseled, beveled edge tip, because these pads are pretty small and you really need a fine tip to get in there. You should pay pretty close attention to the printout on the top of the PCB where you're putting your components. There's a visual symbol as to which way you should mount some of the components, like the capacitor and the pins. I'm not even sure if it's that important, but why take the chance? Just double, triple check that you're putting the components on in the right way, and you'll be fine. As you can see, I'm using this blue sticky tack stuff that you put posters on walls with. I don't have a pair of helping hands, but this stuff is like a poor man's helping hands. Just use it to glom things into place, keep them steady while I'm got the board flipped over and soldering. It works really well. On these bigger pads for the potentiometers, you don't need to fill that whole thing up with solder. You can, but it's just not necessary. Just put enough to make the connection and to keep a sturdy mount for the component. God forbid if you ever have to take the component out. It's a hell of a lot harder to do it when it's just chock full of solder. So some of the pins came bent, and I really very cautiously had to bend them back with my hand, and then tried using a tweezer as well, just to very gingerly put them back into place so that they would seat correctly. Before I screwed the back on, I just plugged it in real quick to make sure it worked, and somehow it did. And just flush cut some loose strands, tighten up the screws, and voila. Yeah, so just like with the HEX COR, I got the HEX LAG DIY kit. It's got the PCB and a bunch of little bits. They both looked kind of cool, so I thought I'd get both of them. This build was actually a little bit more challenging than the HEX COR because there were more of these surface-mounted capacitors, and the things are just so damn small that they can be a little bit tricky to deal with. They kept slipping out of my tweezers a little bit, but I got them on. So you can see me trying to suck some solder off of one of these capacitors because I thought I had installed it the wrong way. Again, there's a visual language printed on the PCB that lets you know which way you need to mount the components. And I didn't pay close enough attention to that the first time there, so I'm fixing my mistake. And honestly, I don't know if it really matters, but why take the chance? But you can see I'm having a little bit of difficulty with it because the damn thing is just so small and slippery. Also, because this PCB is just smaller than the HEX COR, it was just a little fiddlier. It would move around a little bit more, so I found myself using this blue sticky tack just to kind of hold things in place a little bit more often than I would do with the HEX COR build. But again, I don't consider myself an expert solderer. So, again, let me try that again. I don't consider myself an expert in soldering. So, if I can do it, you can too. If you're mounting multiple components at the same time, sometimes I'll just put one solder joint on one component and then one solder joint on the next component, and then once they've been tacked into place, then they're not going to be moving, and then it's a little easier to fill in the rest of the joints. It's important to just keep checking your work while you're soldering, especially if you aren't super confident like myself. It's good to pick up the piece and just check it in different angles. Make sure that you've got good solder joints on there and that the components are mounted flush and they look sturdy. Oh yeah, I sped this video up. I don't normally move this fast. But this build did take considerably longer than the HEX COR build. And like I said, it's just because of those surface mounted components. Just a note about these chips and these capacitors, they're all real small and they look pretty similar, so you got to make sure you've got the right one in the right position. They've got writing on them, so you know what they are, but the writing is microscopic, so if you have a hard time seeing, you might need a magnifying glass. Just make sure that you've got the right component in the right position. And like with the HEX COR DIY build, HEX HAUS has a lag build video as well, and 100% gotta watch that if you're gonna build this thing. Highly recommended. As I was checking my work, I saw that there was a pad that might just have had some solder real close to the adjoining pad, so I just put my solder sucker out there and sucked a little bit off. That's phrasing, I should not have said that. I put my sucker solder well, I fixed the problem. But seriously though, it's a pretty straightforward build. It took me from sitting down to standing up, took me maybe an hour. So there you have it. Voila.